And yet we see stats coming out of places like the United States, where some 75% of the youth believe that Marxist socialism is the way forward. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do they believe that? And the answer is radical professors. They are being radicalized at university level.
A wave of political correctness is sweeping the world. What are the potential consequences of this? Well, joining us back on the CRA channel is Douglas Kruger, who's a commentator and author of a new book called Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. Douglas, welcome back to the CRA channel. Could you tell our viewers what are the potential downsides of this increased incidence of wokeness or political correctness?
Yes, thanks, David, and great to be back with you. Anyone who's been paying attention to society for the last few years, and particularly for the last couple of decades, will have noticed this massive progression of woke ideas, radical ideas, politically correct ideas. And it's easy to assume that it has come out of nowhere. But in fact, in the book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good, I trace its genesis all the way from Rousseau up to today. So this has been incubating for a couple of hundred years. And my great fear about this is the possibility of a new dark age. Now, that may sound melodramatic on the surface of it, but a dark age is not what we think of stereotypically when we think of medieval peasants reveling in the mud and creating scenarios that make for good memes on Facebook. A dark age is in fact defined by one generation's inability to transmit its values to the next generation. And I think something important has changed here. Over the past 3,000 some years, we have been engaged in this project of building human civilization. And the process follows something very much like the scientific method. Everything that doesn't work slowly but surely gets weeded out and discarded. Everything that does work prevails and becomes a part of the superstructure of civilization, and we live with its benefits today. I think for the first time in human history, we are embarked on this radical project of trying to knock out the underpinnings, and we have made the assumption that you can do so safely. And I think we're heading for trouble on that one. And you see it in small instances like attempts at canceling doctors' use, and you see it in more serious instances like the attempt to gut and eradicate classical thinkers, the idea that maths is somehow racist. In other places around the world, you see things like a move to pull down a statue to Winston Churchill, one of the great figures who helped our civilization to survive. And I'm very concerned about what we are handing to the next generation. And I think if it's left unchecked, and if it is continually gutted by this culture of repudiation, we are headed for a new dark age.
We live in uncertain times. Click here to find out how the CRA can help you to understand, prepare, and prosper.
So Douglas, we at the Center for Risk Analysis focus essentially on political and economic risks. What are some of the risks that you have flagged in terms of this new global ideological movement?
Yes, I've set myself the goal of identifying, debunking, and dismantling these ideas and trying my best to help other people to articulate what's wrong with them. Because we tend to have this sense of moral queasiness when we encounter woke mobs or politically correct ideas. But it's often very difficult to put your finger on what exactly is wrong with it. And I like to try to help people to articulate these things, particularly because they are coached in terms of fairness and justice. And I point out that when carried out as prescribed, they are anything but. So if it were your goal to bring about, to engineer a new dark age, here are just 5 ways in which you can actually go about that. And I think as we go through this, you'll see these mechanics at play in the world around you. The first one is you encourage diversity, but only approved diversity. Now, diversity is perhaps the watchword of people who practice political correctness. And on the surface, it sounds like such a good idea. It's about welcoming people into this ever-expanding first-person plural. It's about more welcoming societies and so forth. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice that it's only about the kind of diversity that is approved. Now, we look at this and we wonder where it comes from. It was engineered by a man named Herbert Marcuse. And Herbert Marcuse effectively, I'm going to use the word, infected academia some decades ago. And his core idea was the opposite of the scientific method. If the scientific method is about vetting what works and discarding what doesn't, His recommendation was that to be more inclusive, we should ignore the vetted ideas. He called them, in order to sound more sinister, these were now the embedded ideas. And here we start playing with ideas of power structures. Instead of an idea being scientifically or academically vetted throughout human history, now an idea is embedded, and that is sinister. So his proposal, and this has become mainstream in academia, which of course then impacts the rest of us down the line, is that we should ignore the embedded or vetted ideas and focus only on the radical. And that is the very heart and soul of far left politics, which says we don't value the past and we don't carry forward what we have learned. We are not about the preservation of old values. We see something sinister in that. Instead, we are about constant revolution. And that is straight out of Karl Marx. His idea was that there would never be an end to human history because there would be constant revolution against the old order. So that's the first way to do it. You encourage diversity, but diversity is a ruse word. It is everything but the civilization that we have built up. Number two, you carry out the same dynamic on a bigger scale using the tech and the media platforms. I don't think we need to bang on about the idea that the media tends to be incredibly biased in one direction these days, but let's just look at the tech platforms. I was fascinated last year to see one of the Google executives hauled before the US Congress for once again shutting down and censoring information toward a certain viewpoint. And as part of these hearings, they asked the executive, how do you define fairness? How does Google understand the word fair? Now, for you or I, brought up on some 3,000 years of civilizational evolution, we would probably define fair according to right and wrong or truth and mistruth. They don't. They point out that their understanding of fair is the suppression of voices in power and the uplifting of marginalized voices. And that's pure Marcuse. That's the exact same thing once again. It's not about who is morally right or wrong. It is not about any concept of truthfulness. Instead, it is those who have been around for a long time are obviously sinister, and those who do not have power are clearly in the right. And quite aside from Marcuse, this comes to us from a very toxic philosopher from France named Foucault. It's this idea that there is no truth, there is no good or bad, there are only masks for power. And that is the kind of thinking that we are seeing disseminated by the world's biggest tech platforms. I think it is incredibly dangerous when your access to information, to ideas, and the thing that nudges you toward an understanding of right or wrong is mediated by very young men who believe that they have a finger on what is right and what is wrong. And here, of course, I'm referring to the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter, who have been astonishingly effective at curating information recently. And when you pit them against people like, let's just take one example, Sir Roger Scruton, who was knighted for his services to humanity. This is a man who has certain ideas about what is morally right and wrong, and they are diametrically opposed to the ideas of someone like the CEO of Twitter. But we have the CEO of Twitter as a young man, certain of himself that he's got it right, and the thinkers who have come before him have got it wrong. So that's technique or idea number two in terms of how you engineer a dark age. You cut off the values of the past. You make it difficult for one generation to disseminate them to the next in any grand form. The third way that you do that is to overtly promote Marxist socialism. Now, in the book that you mentioned, that political correctness does more harm than good, and in a new one that I've just written called How to Grow Rich, 50 Ways to Debunk Money Myths, I go through all the history, the fallacies, the right and wrong about free market trade and how that helps people and helps individual human rights versus Marxist socialism. Now, there's no contest between these two, and yet we see stats coming out of places like the United States where some 75% of the youth believe that Marxist socialism is the way forward. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do they believe that? And the answer is radical professors. They are being radicalized at university level. And the professors will often openly state that their goal is to break down everything their parents taught them and to instill a new and radical and revolutionary world view. That is the formula for a dark age. The next thing is to to use non-stop propaganda words, and you use this terminology until it becomes unquestioned. I'll give you just one example of this one. If you think about how human society unfolds, probably the two greatest influences on our thinking, our civilization today are Athens and Jerusalem. And Athens in terms of science and philosophy and logical thinking and medicine and so on, and Jerusalem in terms of spiritual values and understandings of right and wrong and good and evil. Put those two together and give them some 2,000 years of human development, and we come up with our ideas like human rights and the sacrosanct nature of the individual. And we owe that to the people who have come before us. Now, I think that one of the best things that we do is to raise up our children and to make sure that they can live better than we did. I think that as human beings, as a species, as mammals, the best thing you can do is make life slightly better for your children. So how on earth do you vilify that? How do you break from that past and create a generation that does not value that? Well, it's actually quite simple. You just relabel that dynamic with a bad word. You call it privilege. Now, how often have we heard this word privilege over the course of the last 10 years? In the media, in public discourse, we no longer even speak about merit. We no longer even speak about what is good about a civilization that raises up its children and tries to do well for the next generation. We have come to call that privilege. There is something very wrong with that idea, and I think it is very dangerous. And the fifth way in which you engineer a new dark age is to proliferate hate speech laws. Now, hate speech laws are just such a prime example of something that poses as kindness and sounds good. Because why on earth would we allow hate? Well, when you start digging into these things, you start to discover that hate speech laws protect as sacred everything that attacks our inherited civilization. And they protect these things even as they attack our inherited civilization. Now, we can go into great detail on this one, but I'll give you just a quick example. One of the sort of the PC fads that we've been seeing recently, and some of the places around the world have started legislating against this and saying it's child abuse, is this idea of transgenderism among children. Now, I know the history of this. I've documented it in my book. It begins with a man, a fraudulent scientist, and frankly, quite an evil man by the name of Dr. John Money. Dr. John Money established this idea that we now all take as settled that gender is a social construct. The experiment in which he determined this resulted in the death by suicide of his 2 child subjects. This was, and there's much more to that story, this was a profoundly evil man. And yet we take that as scientific knowledge today, and hate speech laws determine that you cannot speak out against it, nor can you question it. Now, when you have verifiable science in conflict with hate speech laws, and hate speech laws winning out, you have a societal problem on your hands. That stultifies conscience and speech and the possibility of transmitting good ideas to the next generation. Now, David, there are many other ways in which we are actively engineering a new dark age by which we will not transmit values to the next generation, but those are just 5 of the primary ones, and I think some good examples of what concerns me when I speak about political correctness.
So Douglas, what are some of the strategies that ordinary people, common sense folk can use to push back against this rising tide of wokeness?
Well, there are many things that we can do, and let me give you just a few useful starters. The very first one, I had the chance to chat with Gareth Cliff about this, and he expressed it so well. He said the primary casualty of political correctness is the truth. So step number 1, have the courage to speak the truth. And that implies that you are going to be speaking out against woke mobs. You might be the only voice, but someone has to speak the truth. Have the courage to do so. That's the banner headline. In terms of more practical things that we can do, I think we need to get postmodernism out of our schools, and particularly poisonous thinkers like Foucault. Foucault is the most cited thinker in the humanities today. And this is a man who, firstly, doesn't believe in science or right or wrong, which is why we have discussions today about how maths might be racist, which I think would come as a great surprise to the ancient Chinese, Arabic, Indian thinkers from around the world who have contributed to this objective language of mathematics. But Foucault, just here's a passing thought on him. This is a man who asserted that it is child abuse not to permit underage children to have sexual relationships with adults. And he is the most cited thinker in the humanities today. So we have to get postmodernism out of our schools. It is undermining and destroying the civilizational benefits that we are trying to pass on. The next thing, and a practical one, institutions that champion classical liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and so forth, have to actively oppose hate speech laws. And this is a tough one because they have to educate the public on why there is something wrong with a hate speech law. And the law, I mean, the phrasing itself makes it sound unassailable. It sounds like if you attack it, you are obviously in favor of hate. But what is happening here is they are shutting down conscience, they are shutting down truth, and we have never had a society in human history that has censored its way into good health. It always goes in the opposite direction. And I think also we need to be able to articulate and teach why certain inherited ideas are superior to the radical ideas that are being proposed. And I'll give you just a very quick example of that one. When we talk about free market trade versus Marxist socialism, I always teach that the first thing you need to say to an opponent in a debate, or the first thing you need to know, is that there are only three ways to get human beings to do things. They are love, trade, or force. Those are your only options. Now, what happens under Marxist socialism is we are effectively conned into believing that socialism equals love. It does not. It equals force. It must be done by an all-powerful central government. And that in every instance, in every historical instance, has become a tyranny. Now, love, by which we do things because we care for each other, such as charity or raising our children, is eminently compatible with free trade. There are some interesting stats that go with that one. For example, the United States is still seen as the world's leading capitalist nation. It is also the world's most charitable nation, both in terms of outright giving to others, outright spend, and it comes in the top 3 in terms of hours donated to charity. Now, by contrast to that, the world's leading socialist nation, China, ranks last when it comes to charity, last in the world. And I think that tells us a great deal about this idea of pitting kindness and love against economic systems. Now, if people could articulate that, we would not be facing a scenario in which the majority of the youth think that this represents kindness. So being able to articulate these ideas and express why the civilization we have built up, which is so hard won, is in so many ways superior to what is being proposed as a replacement, I think is half the battle won.
Well, thanks very much, Douglas. Let us know what you think. What is the cause of this ever-increasing prevalence of wokeness in our society? My name is David Ansara. This is the Center for Risk Analysis. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and also check out the links in the description below to Douglas's book and his YouTube channels. Until next time, take care.